Welcome to this instruction video for how supply is simulated in the 1985 series of games by Thin Red Line Games. Units and bases must have access to supply in order to function at full capacity. If units do not have access to supply, they suffer from penalties with respect to movement and combat capabilities. There are two alternative rule sets for supply in the 1985 games: generic and detailed supply rules. The detailed supply rules are more realistic than the generic supply rules, but also require a bit more administration. Before commencing a game, the players must agree if they use the detailed or generic supply rules. This detailed guide to how supply works is based on version 32 of the rules and assumes you have a basic understanding of the key game concepts. For an overview of these concepts, please see my Introduction to 1985 video, link in the comments section. We will first explore the generic supply rules and subsequently look at the detailed supply rules. NATO and Warsaw Pact supply sources are LOC boxes with supply source symbols. A friendly controlled road or railroad hex on the operational map is also a NATO or Warsaw Pact supply source if it has an uninterrupted path via land connections to a LOC box with a supply source symbol, as in this example. For more details on how the lines of communications map links to the operational maps, please see the Introduction to 1985 video. In certain game scenarios, NATO can activate additional supply sources on the LOC map by one or more so-called sea lines of communication. In this video, we will not explore how a sea line of communication is activated in practice. Denmark and Norway are members of NATO, but have special rules for supply sources separate from the standard rules applying to NATO countries. In the case of Denmark, a friendly controlled city hex inside Denmark is a supply source for Danish units. For Norwegian units, a friendly controlled city, urban, airfield, or naval base inside Norway is a supply source. LOC boxes marked as national territory are supply sources for countries that are not part of NATO, the US faction, or the Warsaw Pact, like Saudi Arabia in this example. Furthermore, for countries that are not part of NATO, the US faction, or the Warsaw Pact, city and urban hexes inside the national territory are also valid supply sources. Again, Saudi Arabia is a good example of this. Note, however, that if a hex qualifying as a supply source becomes surrounded by enemy ZOCs, it loses its supply source status. This applies to all countries. Thus, in this example, the Norwegian brigade in Sandefjord is not in supply, as even though Sandefjord is a Norwegian urban hex and normally qualifies as a supply source, Sandefjord is now surrounded by enemy zones of control and thus loses its status as a supply source. Also note that the naval base south of Larvik also loses its status as a supply source when the Soviet unit's zone of control over it means that the naval base is no longer friendly controlled. Finally, note that once a country joins NATO or the US faction, its units may also use NATO supply sources. Correspondingly, once a country joins the Soviet faction, its units may also use Warsaw Pact supply sources. Now that we have established where supply comes from, let's look at supply paths. Simply put, a supply path is a continuous path of land hexes and LOC boxes connected by land. A supply path starts from the unit or airbase being evaluated and ends at the supply source, and not the other way around. Also, the warring sides can use various means to extend their supply networks, most commonly through the use of HQ units. We will look at the specific supply path details for the various factions and nationalities shortly. Common to all nations and factions is that several different obstacles block supply paths. A supply path cannot be traced in the following situations: a hex containing an enemy ground unit, hexes in enemy zone of control, unless the hex contains a friendly unit, Hexes with nuclear or chemical contamination, major rivers unless they are bridged, alpine hexes and alpine hex sides. Also, a supply path cannot be traced in a LOC box containing enemy combat units and no friendly combat units. As previously alluded to, note that the maximum length and other requirements of a supply path depend upon the type and nationality of the unit tracing supply. Also note that the length of a supply path is calculated in movement points for road mode and not in hexes, with the notable exception that for all types of Arctic terrain and swamps, tactical mode is used to calculate movement points for supply path length purposes. Also, supply path length is impacted by enemy interdiction airstrikes on hexes that form part of the supply path. Hence, your meticulously positioned brigade being ready to assault may suddenly find itself struggling with supply because a well-timed enemy air attack on its supply line. We'll look closer at these matters later in this video. But first, let's look at when supply status is relevant and consequences for units of not having access to supply. The supply status of a ground unit is checked when it commences its movement and at the instant it participates in combat, either as attacker or defender. Hence, the supply status of a ground unit is irrelevant once it has begun its movement, as long as it stands still and as long as it is not participating in combat. Also remember that firing of artillery or flak is not considered to be participating in combat. Instead, artillery and flak units must have access to ammunition when firing. We'll get back to how ammunition for artillery and flak works later. The supply status of an airbase, and thus for air units and helicopters based at the airbase, is determined each time an air unit or helicopter takes off for a mission. Likewise, the supply status of a helicopter unit not based at an airbase is also determined each time the unit takes off for a mission. So now that we know when to determine supply status for units and bases, let's look at the various statuses of supply a unit or base may have. Basically, a unit or base can be in general supply, limited supply, or out of supply. Units and bases are in general supply if supply paths are traced to supply sources without involving an undeveloped land connection on the LOC map. Units and bases are in limited supply if their traced supply paths involve an undeveloped land connection on the LOC map, or, more commonly, if the source of supply is itself in limited supply. Let's look at two examples of this. Firstly, the road hex in entry box TK2 on the northern edge of this map is a supply source in general supply for the Warsaw Pact, as there is an uninterrupted path from there to the Warsaw Pact supply source in the North Caucasus 1 LOC box. In the second example, the Soviets have achieved undisputed control of the originally Iranian LOC boxes Iran 3 and IR. Yes, Iran and the Soviet Union are enemies in this conflict. This creates a Warsaw Pact supply source on the eastern edge of this map in the IR1 entry box. However, this supply source is only in limited supply, as two of the land connections from IR1 to the supply source in North Caucasus 1 are undeveloped land connections. So, before beginning their movement, our friends here in the Soviet 42nd Mechanized Guards Division check their supply status. And as they trace their supply path to a supply source in general supply, the division is also in general supply. This means that it can potentially spend a maximum of 50 movement points during their move. Of course, they might be subject to fatigue if they spend more than the basic movement allowance of 20 movement points, but how fatigue works is not a subject of this video. Their colleagues in the 14th Armoured Division are not as fortunate. They trace a supply path to a supply source in limited supply, which means they are also in limited supply. This means that they under no circumstances can spend more than 20 movement points during their move, and that if they engage in combat, both as attacker or defender, add 2 to the opponent's combat modifiers. Also, note that the two Soviet divisions on the LOC map are in limited supply, as their supply paths to the supply source in North Caucasus 1. Contain at least one undeveloped land connection. Air bases, aircrafts and helicopters function at full capacity both when in general and limited supply. None of them suffer any adverse effects from being in limited supply. Having units and bases being out of supply is a nasty affair. Air bases, aircrafts and helicopters are considered out of supply if a valid supply path cannot be traced for either limited or general supply at the point in time when an air unit or helicopter intends to take off on a mission. Aircrafts and helicopters can execute only ferry missions when they are out of supply, basically only moving from one base to another. A ground unit, however, is not immediately considered out of supply, even if it cannot trace a path to a supply source when checking. Instead, a ground unit that is neither in limited nor general supply can move and engage in combat, but when doing so it has a Fuel 1 marker placed under it. At the beginning of the next friendly movement phase, the player checks all his units with Fuel 1 markers. Units with a Fuel 1 marker that are back in supply have the marker removed, and those units may operate as normal. However, units that remain out of supply have the marker replaced with an out-of-supply marker and are now considered out of supply. A ground unit that finds itself in this predicament may not expend more than 5 movement points during a friendly movement phase. It cannot voluntarily initiate combat, and when involved in combat if attacked, it adds 8 to the enemy combat modifiers. These conditions apply until the unit is back in supply. So far we have covered supply sources, supply status, and supply paths in general, but let's now look at supply path length and requirements for the various nationalities and factions involved in the conflict. And we'll start with NATO. Firstly, in addition to what's been said previously about supply status, a NATO country off-map base with an undamaged port is always in general supply. Diego Garcia is a good example of this. On the bases sheet, it is easy to see that this is an off-map base, as the base location DG1 refers to a box on the LOC map and not to an operational map hex number. Also note that Diego Garcia is both a naval base and an air base. The yellow anchor tells you it is a naval base, and the orange triangle identifies the used section of an air base. Like 20 here, any other NATO airbase must trace a supply path of any length to a valid supply source. As mentioned previously, aircrafts and helicopters have the same supply status as its base. A NATO HQ like the German HQ here can trace a supply path of any length to a valid supply source. Other NATO ground units and helicopters not based at an airfield must trace a supply path of 15 or fewer movement points, not hexes, to qualifying supply sources, including HQs of the same nationality as in this example. When a division or brigade has been broken down, as in this case of the West German 6th Division, its subordinate components must use the corresponding division base as a supply source. Hence, in this example, the 16th Brigade of the 6th Division must use its division base as supply source, and furthermore, it cannot be more than 10 movement points away. On to Warsaw Pact supply specifics. Like Aden here, a Warsaw Pact country off-map base with an undamaged port is always in limited supply unless it is in general supply by other means. Like for NATO, any other Warsaw Pact air bases must trace a supply path of any length to a valid supply source. Aircrafts and helicopters have the same supply status as its base. The Soviet faction and Warsaw Pact supply chains have an additional component in the front supply head. A front supply head's supply path can be of any length, however, max 5 hexes in the supply path can be hexes without roads, railroads, urban or city terrain. Also, the distance for Warsaw Pact supply paths from HQs to valid supply sources, including front supply heads, is only 10 or fewer movement points, and the same applies to Warsaw Pact units tracing supply to HQs. The rules applying to broken down Warsaw Pact units are a bit different compared to the rules applying to NATO. In the Warsaw Pact case, such a supply path must be 5 or fewer movement points, but it may trace the path to its base unit, to a Warsaw Pact HQ, to a front supply head, or to a valid supply source. All in all, this means that the opponent's chains of supply are somewhat different, a fact both sides have to pay close attention to when planning operations. Countries that are neither members of NATO nor the Warsaw Pact are subject to the following rules relating to supply. An airbase must trace a supply path of any length to a valid supply source. Aircrafts and helicopters have the same supply status as its base. Remember that LOC boxes marked as national territory are supply sources for countries that are not part of NATO, the US faction, or the Warsaw Pact. Hence, off-map bases for non-NATO and non-Warsaw Pact countries are in most cases in general supply. An HQ must trace a supply path of 10 or fewer movement points to a qualifying supply source. Other ground units and helicopters not based at an airfield must trace a supply path of 10 or fewer movement points to qualifying supply sources, including HQs of the same nationality. When a division or brigade has been broken down, its subordinate components can use the parent division base or brigade base, an HQ, or another valid supply source as a source for supply. Such a supply path cannot be more than 5 movement points long. Remember that if an initially neutral country joins the US faction or the Soviet faction, it may also use NATO or Warsaw Pact supply sources when determining supply status. As discussed, a supply path can only extend across land. So let's look at how players can establish supply for units on the other side of an expanse of sea. First, note that there are a couple of important exceptions to the supply rules we've just gone through that relate to when ground units have been transported via air or sea. Firstly, a ground unit transported by aircraft or helicopter keeps the same supply status for the remainder of the game turn as it had when it embarked. Thus, as the airbase in Kaliningrad is in general supply, the 37th Airborne keeps its general supply status for the ongoing game turn, even after being airdropped east of Karlskrona, despite it not having a land connection to a supply source. Secondly, a ground unit landed amphibiously is automatically in general supply for the remainder of the game turn. So the Soviet Marine Brigade also remains in general supply for the rest of the game turn after capturing the garrisoned Karlskrona naval base. Thirdly, in the turn following debarkation from air or naval transport, airmobile, airborne, marine and special forces units are automatically in limited supply unless they are in a megahex with enemy air superiority, in which case they are out of supply. Hence, in our case, if the Swedes manage to establish air superiority over Karlskrona in the game turn after debarkation, our Soviet brigades will be out of supply, unless they manage to establish supply in another way. However, if the Swedes do not establish an air superiority area in the game turn after debarkation, our Soviet brigades are in limited supply for the remainder of that turn, even if they cannot trace a valid supply path. Starting from the second turn after the turn of debarkation, no special rules apply and normal supply rules are in force. It is evident from the above that it is essential for an invading force to quickly capture and make ready a port that can be used as an overseas supply source. In the rules, this is called a convoy supply source. If the invading force fails to establish a convoy supply source, they will quickly find themselves out of supply on enemy shores. A recipe for disaster. Alright, so let's go through how to activate an overseas supply source using a convoy. The Soviet brigades managed to capture the naval base in Karlskrona. However, as combat was required to capture the base, it got damaged in the process. As damaged ports cannot support convoys, the base must be repaired before it can be used as a port for convoy purposes by the Soviets. Repairs are made during the end phase of the sequence of play, and the Soviet player duly expends the required repair points to repair Karlskrona naval base. Now, a valid arrival port for convoy purposes has been established. Note that in a real game, the Soviet player would have wanted to eliminate the Swedish coastal battery south of Karlskrona before the amphibious landing, but let's ignore that detail. Moving on to the next game turn, one of the first items in the sequence of play is the convoy phase. This is when convoys are created and reorganized as required. Baltijsk is a Soviet naval base in Supply, so it is a valid starting port for a convoy, and the Soviet player proceeds in allocating ships to the convoy. The details of how to allocate transport ships and escorts to a convoy will not be discussed here, but suffice to say that a minimum number of supply transport capacity is required for a convoy to provide supply. If the supply transport capacity of the convoy is from 3 to 5, the supply source at the arrival port is a limited supply source. If the supply transport capacity of the convoy is 6 or more, the supply source at the arrival port is a general supply source. If the supply transport capacity of the convoy is 2 or less, it does not provide any supply at all. In our example, 9 points of supply capacity have been allocated to the convoy, so the supply source in Karlskrona will be in general supply. Once naval units included in the convoy have been established, the player plots the route of the convoy between the starting port and arrival port. And hey presto, the Soviets have now established a supply source on the Swedish side of the Baltic Sea. But do remember these points. Should Baltijsk for some reason lose its supply status, the arrival port of the convoy also loses its supply source status. The convoy can be attacked or interrupted in a number of different ways. For example, if an enemy combat unit manages to assert a zone of control over the path of the convoy, which can happen across a river or inlet, the convoy supply source ceases to function. The convoy can be attacked anywhere along its route by enemy air and naval units. Also, if either the starting port or arrival port for the convoy becomes damaged, the overseas supply source loses its ability to provide supply. So, remember to assign escorts to your convoys and stack up with anti-air capacity covering your overseas supply sources. When playing with the generic supply rules, players do not track ammunition use for ground combat units. However, ammunition levels are tracked for artillery, for certain flak units, and for naval units. Let's start with artillery. Artillery units trace supply paths exactly as described previously for movement purposes. But when artillery units fire, instead of checking supply status, an artillery unit expends 1 ammunition point. All artillery units, regardless of country or faction, have a maximum of 3 ammunition points, and if an artillery unit is out of ammunition, it cannot fire. Artillery ammunition is replenished during the end phase of each game turn using the standard supply path validation. If during the end phase an artillery unit is found to be in general supply, it receives its full allotment of ammunition. If it is found to be in limited supply, it receives only 1 ammunition point. If it cannot trace any supply path, it does not receive any ammunition at all. Now let's turn to flak. Depending upon the target, the type of unit firing, the firing unit's flak rating, units may or may not have to spend flak ammunition when firing at enemy aircrafts or helicopters. We will not go into the details here of which units that have to track flak ammunition status, but when it comes to movement, all flak units trace supply the same way as other ground units. When it comes to firing, all flak units that are required to keep track of flak ammunition have a maximum of 3 flak ammunition points. If a firing action requires use of flak ammunition points, 1 point is expended. Just as for artillery, flak ammunition is replenished during the end phase of each game turn using the standard supply path validation. If the replenishing unit is found to be in general supply, it receives full allotment of flak ammunition. If it is found to be in limited supply, it receives 1 flak ammunition point. If it cannot trace any supply path, it does not receive any ammunition. On to naval units. In the 1985 games, ships are considered to have enough fuel and supply onboarded to be able to operate for the time period covered by any scenario or campaign. However, naval units have three types of ammunition players must keep track of: missiles, anti-submarine warfare, and combined naval flak and missile defense. For these three types, a naval unit can have the following statuses. For missiles, it can be in full supply or have a missile halved status. For anti-submarine warfare, it can be in either full supply or ASW halved status. For combined naval flak and missile defense, it can either be in full supply or suffer from a degraded performance, marked with a flak ammo 1 marker. A naval unit can never fully run out of any of the ammunitions. A naval unit can restore full ammunition capabilities during the end phase of a game turn if it finds itself in a friendly naval base or in a friendly port on the LOC map. Alternatively, it can resupply at sea if it is located in the same task force or megahex as a ship with ASK or TAK type designation, assuming the supply ships are of the same nationality or part of the same faction or alliance as the ship resupplying. This concludes the guide to the generic supply rules. Hence, for anyone who doesn't intend to play the games using the detailed supply rules, this is a good point to leave this video and start to plot the supply network for your next operation into enemy land. For us others that love a logistical challenge, we'll explore the detailed supply rules in depth. The main differences between the generic and the detailed supply rules are the introduction of tracking of fuel usage, tracking of ammunition for combat purposes, the introduction of stockpiled supply points, and the added ability for combat units to carry with them fuel and ammunition, so-called embedded supply. These changes also have significant impact on the functioning of convoys. We'll explore all of these in more detail later. First and foremost, let's remember that the standard supply network for units and bases also applies when playing with detailed supply rules. For example, if a unit can trace a valid supply path to general or limited supply source when moving or engaging in combat, they are good to go as discussed previously. However, when playing with detailed supply rules, we must forget about the out-of-supply mechanism in the generic rules. In the detailed supply rules, it is straightforward. When checking supply status, if a unit or base is not in general or limited supply through the regular supply network, it is out of supply. Hence, no more use of Fuel 1 markers and out-of-supply markers in the way discussed previously. This is where the stockpiled supply points come in. By using stockpiled supply points, units and bases may remain operational even when they cannot trace valid supply paths to supply sources, and thus technically being out of supply. This allows for a much more realistic and flexible simulation, but increases the logistical complexity. All right, let's start exploring how ammunition is handled in the detailed supply rules. For naval ammunition purposes, the generic and detailed supply rules are identical, so we will not discuss that further in this section. Furthermore, except for one important difference, the rules for tracking ammunition usage for artillery and flak purposes are also identical in the generic and detailed supply rules. The difference is that resupply of artillery and flak ammunition can be made in 2 instead of 1 ways when playing with detailed supply rules, either by leveraging the regular supply network as in the generic supply rules, or by using stockpiled supply points as laid out in the detailed supply rules. In the coming examples, let's ignore how the supply points have gotten to where they are. We'll get to that later. Thus, during the end phase of each game turn, artillery and flak units can trace a valid supply path to either a supply source or to stockpiled supply points. If the unit traces a supply path to a supply source, the number of ammunition points replenished are the same as in the generic rules. However, if the unit instead resupply using stockpiled supply points, each artillery ammunition point costs 2 supply points and each flak ammunition point costs 1 supply point. Remember that the supply paths in both cases must always comply with the supply path rules for the relevant nation and faction. Now let's turn to ammunition for ground combat purposes. In the detailed supply rules, as in the generic supply rules, the supply status of a ground unit is checked every time it is involved in ground combat. When playing with detailed supply rules, there are two ways a ground unit can establish supply for combat purposes. Firstly, as in the generic supply rules, ground units can leverage the regular supply network. And in the detailed supply rules, a ground unit can, in addition, use stockpiled supply points for combat purposes. Actually, for combat units only, as opposed to support units, there are three ways to establish supply for combat purposes, but we'll get to the third option for combat units later. Let's look at a couple of examples. Firstly, if the ground unit is in general supply through the regular supply network, the unit can fight at its full capacity. So, in this case, both the East German Division and the West German Brigade, fighting across the Elbe-Lübeck Canal, can trace valid supply paths to supply sources and thus can fight at full capacity, just as when playing with the generic supply rules. Secondly, if a ground unit is in limited supply through the regular supply network when engaged in combat, the enemy adds 2 to its combat modifiers. Hence, for this tank battle in the desert, the Iranian division benefits from +2 to its combat modifiers, as the Soviet division is only in limited supply. Again, this is identical to how the generic supply rules function. Thirdly, in the detailed supply rules, instead of relying on the general supply network as in the two previous examples, a ground unit can use stockpiled supply points when engaging in combat. Let's jump to Arctic Norway to take a look at how this works. Here, a Soviet division attacks a Norwegian brigade to gain access to an important bridge. Both units are out of supply, and as this is the detailed supply rules, they are not subject to the out-of-supply process described in the generic supply rules. However, the logistics people of both sides have managed to bring supply points to places nearby the critical bridge. Again, we'll get back later to how this was done. The Norwegians have access to 6 supply points and the Soviets to 8. As usual, when combat begins, we check for supply status. As we know, both sides are technically out of supply, but can trace valid supply paths to their stockpiled supply points. Both sides now spend 1 ammunition point. Every instance of ground combat costs 1 ammunition point. Hence, if units participate in several combats during a movement phase, several ammunition points must be spent. Actually, it is supply points that are consumed, but ammunition points are converted to supply points according to this table. Hence, the Norwegian brigade spends 3 supply points, and the Soviet division 6 supply points. The Soviet unit is now in a difficult predicament. It is out of supply and does not have access to enough supply points to pay for an additional round of combat. This means A, that it cannot initiate combat, and B, that if attacked, it grants the opponent a +8 combat modifier. The Norwegian brigade commander, who has access to enough supply points for another round of combat, is rubbing his hands. Before moving on to the subject of fuel, note that it is voluntary to use supply points. Looking at our Soviet division in the desert again, and let's assume it has access to at least 6 supply points. In this case, the Soviet commander has a choice. He can leverage the regular supply network and afford the opponent a +2 combat modifier, as the division is in limited supply, or he can spend the 6 supply points, the cost for 1 ammunition point for a division, and not award the opponent any combat benefits. When playing with detailed supply rules, access to fuel becomes an important matter for ground units. Only ground units have to be concerned about fuel. Fuel status does not impact air, naval, or other unit types. Remember that a ground unit's supply status is checked when it begins its movement. Also remember that units expending more than 20 movement points may suffer from fatigue according to the fatigue rules. Fatigue status is independent from fuel consumption and is not covered in this video. A convenient way of thinking about fuel is to understand how many movement points a specific fuel status provides a ground unit. Let's race across the desert to demonstrate this. Firstly, as in the generic supply rules, a ground unit that is in general supply through the regular supply network has a full allotment of 50 movement points without having to spend any fuel points. A ground unit in limited supply through the general supply network may use 20 movement points or less without having to spend any fuel points. A ground unit that is out of supply is not subject to the out-of-supply process described for the generic supply rules, but may use 5 movement points or less without having to spend any fuel points. A ground unit that is in limited supply through the standard supply network and has a valid supply path to stockpiled supply and consumes supply points equaling 1 fuel point can expend 40 or less movement points during the friendly action phase. If the same unit spends 1 more fuel point, it can expend 50 or less movement points during the friendly action phase. A ground unit that is out of supply and has a valid supply path to stockpiled supply and consumes supply points equaling 1 fuel point can expend 20 or less movement points during the friendly action phase. If the same unit spends 1 more fuel point, it can expend 40 or less movement points during the friendly action phase. And if the same unit spends a 3rd fuel point, it can expend 50 or less movement points during the friendly action phase. The number of supply points required for each fuel point depends upon the type and size of the ground unit according to the following table. So, in the case of the Omani Mechanized Brigade here, it first checks supply status when it begins its move. It is in limited supply, so it merrily uses up 20 movement points without spending any fuel. But it wants to move further, and that costs 1 fuel point, which equals 3 supply points for a brigade. It spends the 3 supply points, and can thus use an additional 20 movement points. It now has 3 supply points equaling 1 fuel point remaining, so it could potentially have bought an additional 10 movement points, but the Omanis decide to stop here. Note that the check for a valid supply path to stockpiled supply happens when the unit starts its movement, and not where it is located when it triggers the expenditure of fuel points. As for ammunition, it is actually supply points that are consumed when a ground unit expends fuel points. Thus, supply points can be used for either ammunition or fuel purposes, which further increases both flexibility and complexity for the head of logistics. Let's return to East Germany for a look at how detailed supply rules apply to airplanes and helicopters. As when playing with the generic supply rules, air units and helicopters are considered out of supply if a valid supply path can be traced neither for general nor for limited supply when the unit intends to take off on a mission. Out-of-supply units can only execute ferry missions. However, air and helicopter units that are technically out of supply may still execute all types of missions if the base where they are located can access stockpiled supply points. More specifically, if an air unit or helicopter can trace a valid supply path using the national rules for helicopters not based on an airbase to stockpiled supply points, it can spend 1 supply point and execute the intended mission. It doesn't matter what type of aircraft or helicopter is involved, or if the unit has taken step losses or not. The cost per unit per mission is always 1 supply point. So, the MiGs in Holzdorf are out of supply but have access to supply points. They spend 1 point and may fly off on a ground strike mission. Now, we have covered how stockpiled supply points are used for fuel, ammunition, air and helicopter missions. But where do supply points come from? That's what we will cover in this section. Simply put, supply points are created at the point in time when they are loaded for transport. Thus, supply points emanate from ports and air bases that are in general or limited supply. This applies to ports and bases both on the operational map and on the LOC map. With regards to transportation, supply points can be transported to bases, ports, LOC boxes and many hexes on the operational map, as long as the means of transport can reach the intended destination. There are essentially 4 ways supply points can be created and transported: convoys, air transport, helicopter transport, and naval transport. First, we'll take a look at how convoys function when playing with detailed supply rules, so let's revisit the Soviet capture of Karlskrona naval base. The 2 Soviet brigades had captured and repaired the naval base, thus turning it into a friendly port. Now, the convoy and the convoy path are established the same way as when playing with standard supply rules. However, when playing with detailed supply rules, convoys do not establish an overseas supply source. Instead, convoys deliver supply points to the arrival port based on this convoy supply delivery table. This happens during the end phase of the game turn. The distance is measured in naval movement points from the starting port of the convoy to the arrival port. Do not count movement points for loading, unloading, docking, and undocking. But do remember that bad weather may impact the distance calculation. The weather is currently fine, so in this case the distance is 4 movement points, and we find the row in the table for distance 4. Then we check the cargo capacity in the convoy, in this case 9 transport points. So the convoy delivers 9 times 1 supply points to Karlskrona. In addition to the above, there are a couple of other differences between general and detailed supply rules. Firstly, when playing with detailed supply rules, the starting port must be able to trace a supply path to a supply source in general supply. If the starting port is out of supply or in limited supply, no supply points are delivered by the convoy. Secondly, when playing with detailed supply rules, the convoy delivers supply points even if the starting or arrival ports are damaged. However, if either or both ports are damaged, the delivered amount of supply points is halved. When playing with detailed supply rules, air transport units can fly resupply missions transporting supply points from an airfield to another undamaged airfield, or to any hex or LOC box by dropping supply points from the air. Many types of air missions can be executed during both sides' movement phases, but air resupply missions can only be executed by the phasing player. Each squadron of transport planes can transport a number of supply points equal to its transport capacity. How many supply points that actually can be created and loaded depends upon the status of the start base, according to this table. Some examples. In our first example, it's the US factions movement phase, and a UK transport squadron stands ready at the East England Air Base. It receives orders to fly supply points to Hopston in West Germany. As the starting airbase is in general supply from a NATO supply source, it has access to an infinite amount of supply points. The transport place loads 3 supply points, which is the maximum it can carry. It takes off and arrives safely in Hopston and unloads the cargo. The NATO player now has 3 supply points in Hopston, accessible for any use as discussed previously. Note that the arrival base doesn't have to be on the operational map. For example, the airfield part of the off-map MD2 base in the Mediterranean would have been an equally valid destination. In the next example, a group of Iranian Basij militia has wandered off and finds itself way out of supply. Normally, such a group would have been left to its own devices, but as this unit is on a special mission, it is critical they receive supply. There are 2 supply points already present at the Kermanshah Air Base, and the base in Kermanshah is in general supply due to its proximity to the city. Normally, this would allow the transport squadron at the base to create and load only 1 supply point per the supply point creation and loading rules. But as there already are 2 pre-existing supply points at the base, the transport unit loads its full capacity of 3 supply points and takes off. There is no friendly airfield to land on nearby the besieged unit, so it will have to be an airdrop. When airdropping supply points, 2/3 are always lost, so only 1 supply point makes it to the intended hex. The airdrop hex must be friendly controlled and not in an enemy zone of control. Also, supply airdrops can only be made to hexes with these terrain types: plain, high plain, Arctic plain, rough 1, Arctic Rough 1, and Urban. Note that supply points can be airdropped in a LOC box as well, but only if friendly units are present at the destination. Do remember that the enemy can fly Interdiction missions and attack the transport planes while in flight, so do bring escort fighters with your air resupply missions. Air resupply missions are also subject to enemy anti-air fire, subject to the Flak rules. Supply points can also be transported by helicopter. Helicopters can load supply points at airfields and on ships with a white or blue helipad symbol. Let's first look at an example when helicopters load supply points at an airfield. Supply points can be created at the airfield according to this table, which is similar to the table for airplanes. Let's return to the battle over the bridge in Arctic Norway. The Norwegian brigade is out of supply and has now only got access to 2 supply points, one too few to be able to take any meaningful action. The 339th Norwegian Helicopter Squadron is currently based at the Banak airfield and will help alleviate the situation. Remember the special rule that Norwegian airfields are a supply source for Norwegian units and that Norway is a NATO country. Hence, the helicopter unit is in general supply and can load any number of supply points up to its transportation capacity. However, the squadron's capacity is just 1, so it loads 1 supply point and takes off. Arriving at the destination, it stays clear of the Soviet division's Flak, lands, unloads its cargo, and returns to Banak. The Norwegian brigade now has access to 3 supply points, at least enough to defend itself once at full capacity. In our second example, the situation around the bridge is identical, but the 339th Helicopter Squadron is based in the small town of Alta instead of at Banak airfield. Alta is indeed a supply source providing general supply for Norwegian units, but as helicopters may only load supply points on airfields and on ships, no supply points can be created in Alta. However, by a stroke of good planning or good fortune, we'll never know which, the USS Incheon, note the white helipad symbol, is located in the bay off Banak, and, even better, it carries with it 2 supply points. Plans are made, and the helicopter squadron sets off towards the Incheon. This type of helicopter squadron can spend max 36 movement points on a mission, so let's count the movement points. Flying from Alta to the Incheon costs 6 movement points. Loading cargo on a ship also costs 6 movement points. Flying to the destination is another 8. Unloading in a hex costs 3 points. The 339th is ordered not to return to Alta and instead base at Banak airfield. This leg of the mission costs 9 movement points. The whole trip consumed 32 points, well within the maximum limit of 36. Again, remember to stay well clear of enemy flak and fly into an enemy air superiority area at your own peril. Not to be confused with convoy supply, naval units with transport capacity can transport supply points from a port in supply to another friendly port. If the naval transport has amphibious landing capabilities, it can also unload supply points at qualifying coastal hexes. Naval transportation of supply points happens during the phasing side's movement phase and not in the convoy phase. Let's start with a simple example. For reasons unbeknownst to us, the Iranians must transport supply from Bushehr to the bottom of the Persian Gulf. The Bandar Abbas is assigned to transport the cargo. Ports can create supply points according to the following table. So, in our case, with no access to NATO or Warsaw Pact supply sources, the third row applies. Note that as long as any length and type of supply path can be established to a supply source, the port can at least generate 1 supply point each game turn. The Iranian ship has a maximum supply cargo capacity of 3, but due to the nature of the supply situation as just discussed, only 1 supply point is generated. The transport process goes as follows, and remember that a non-slow ship like the Bandar Abbas has 12 movement points per turn. Loading at a port costs 2 movement points. Undocking costs 1 movement point. The journey costs 1 movement point per megahex, docking 1 movement point, and finally unloading in port for 2 movement points. The whole maneuver utilized 9 movement points. Now let's return to the Baltic Sea. A Soviet Marine brigade has run out of supply during its invasion of Gotland. A convoy cannot be established as there is no valid arrival port, and delivery of supply via airplane and helicopter has been ruled out for other reasons. The Soviets decide to send supply via naval transport from Liepaja, which will be landed amphibiously, close to the location of the Marines. The first step is to assemble a task force from ships already located in Liepaja Naval Base. First some escorts and then transportation ships. It is essential for the Marines that this operation is completed in one game turn, so the Soviet player is carefully selecting ships with amphibious landing capabilities and high speed, meaning 12 movement points per turn. Assembling the task force costs 2 movement points for each involved ship. Next, the supply points are created and loaded. As we are dealing with a Warsaw Pact port in full supply, the only limit is the transportation capacity of the transport ships, thus 6 supply points in this case. Loading the cargo in port consumes 2 movement points. Next, the task force undocks and sets off towards Gotland and eventually reaches the landing hex. Finally, the supply points are unloaded using the transport ship's amphibious landing capability. This costs another 4 movement points. In total, the operation consumed 12 movement points, on the mark for the movement capacity of all ships in the task force. Now the Marine Brigade can continue its march on Visby. Remember that naval transport operations are vulnerable to aerial, surface and submarine attacks, so protect them well. This wraps up the section on how supply points can be created and transported under the detailed supply rules. Next, we'll move on to a unique capability of ground combat units. As we know, when playing with detailed supply rules, ground units can utilize supply points for fuel and ammo purposes, in addition to leveraging the regular supply network. We also mentioned that for combat units only, thus not for support units, there is a third option. This third option is embedded supply. Embedded supply is the term the rules use to reflect that ground combat units, not support units, can carry with them some reserves of ammunition and fuel for their own use. Embedded supply cannot be shared with other units, and the maximum amount of fuel and ammunition a ground combat unit can bring for themselves is dependent upon the nationality of the unit, according to the following table. Let's return to our Arctic bridge for an example. The Soviet division is out of supply and is also not able to trace a valid supply path to stockpiled supply. However, by using some of its embedded supply, it can still move and engage in combat. The division commander believes supply is on its way, so he decides to attack. As usual, we check supply status for a ground unit when it starts to move. In this case, it is out of supply and cannot access supply points, so it decides to spend an embedded fuel point. It is a Warsaw Pact unit, so it now has 2 fuel points remaining. The spent fuel point buys the division 20 movement points, as you recall from the drag race in the desert previously. It's an all-out effort by the Soviets, so 6 movement points are used on a single echelon assault. Now combat begins, so we have to check for supply status again. This time for both units. Both are out of supply and decide to spend 1 embedded ammo point each. Note that the Norwegian unit could have opted for not using embedded supply, but being out of supply with no access to stockpiled supply would have granted the Soviet division 8 combat modifiers, and that is not an appealing prospect. Also note that the Norwegian unit doesn't have to spend a fuel point as it is not moving. The Norwegian unit is a NATO unit, so it now has 1 ammo point remaining. The combat occurs but results in no changes to positions, but without the Soviet unit being able to attack again, and so the Soviet movement phase ends. When it is the NATO movement phase, the Norwegian unit counterattacks, which means it must spend both a fuel point and an ammo point, while the Soviet unit only spends an ammo point. So, ground combat units can be without access to the regular supply network and have no valid supply path to stockpiled supply points and still operate by using embedded supply, as we've seen. Obviously, as the embedded supply levels are limited and quickly run out, it is important to understand how embedded supply can be replenished. Also, this is the third instance when supply status of a ground combat unit is checked: when it begins its move, when it engages in combat, and when it is replenishing embedded supply. How embedded supply is replenished differs dependent upon the nationality of the ground combat unit replenishing, so let's look at the details. We'll begin with non-Warsaw Pact combat units. For all non-Warsaw Pact combat units, replenishing of embedded supply happens during the end phase of a game turn and works as follows. Ground combat units that are in general supply through the general supply network receive fuel and ammunition up to their allowed maximum. Ground combat units that are in limited supply through the general supply network receive 1 fuel point and 1 ammunition point. A ground combat unit disconnected from the general supply network, but having a valid path to stockpiled supply points, may consume the desired number of supply points to stock up its embedded supply. Remember that the supply points cost per fuel and ammo point depends upon the size of the combat unit. In this case, our Norwegian brigade decides to utilize 6 supply points to stock up to the maximum 2 ammo points and not replenish embedded fuel supply. Let's return to the Soviet division in the Arctic and assume that it has used up all its embedded supply. Hence, it has neither fuel nor ammo. Warsaw Pact ground combat units do not replenish embedded supply during the end phase of a game turn, but instead during the Warsaw Pact movement phase. So let's take a closer look at how this works. We remember that a Warsaw Pact combat unit maximum embedded supply is 3 fuel and 3 ammo, but as Warsaw Pact combat units never can replenish more than 1 ammunition and 1 fuel point during a movement phase, the maximum limit is not an issue in this situation. First of all, if the combat unit can trace a valid supply path for general supply through the regular supply network, it, as shown in the charts and tables, expends 8 movement points and replenish 1 fuel and 1 ammo point. The actual length of the supply path doesn't matter, as long as it is valid per the rules for Warsaw Pact supply paths we discussed previously. For example, if the path to the supply source is 6 movement points long, the replenishment still consumes 8 movement points. Also note that movement points used to replenish ammo and fuel does not count towards the movement point total for fuel consumption. If the division is in limited supply, it can still replenish 1 fuel and 1 ammunition point, but this consumes 12 movement points. A ground combat unit disconnected from the general supply network, but having a valid path to stockpiled supply points, may consume the relevant number of supply points to increase its levels of embedded supply by the maximum 1 fuel and 1 ammunition point. So, in this case, the Soviet division uses 12 supply points for 1 fuel and 1 ammo. This operation expends 8 movement points. Remember what we just said, that movement points used to replenish ammo and fuel does not count towards the movement point total for fuel consumption. Hence, if our division uses the remaining 6 stockpiled supply points to move, it can still move the usual 20 movement points without having to spend even more fuel. The 8 movement points spent on the replenishing are, however, still relevant for non-fuel purposes, like, for example, fatigue checks. Okay, that concludes the guide to the detailed supply rules. But before wrapping up, let's look at how you can interfere with your enemy's meticulously planned logistics operations. First of all, as we touched upon previously, it is always tempting to interfere with the transportation of supply. The enemy's convoys, naval, air and helicopter transports are juicy targets for disruptive naval and air missions. Secondly, messing with the opponent's supply paths is a source of great satisfaction. Here the Iraqi 1st Mechanized Division is on an excursion into enemy country. It is on the limit of its supply path, 9.5 movement points to Kanakin, just within the 10 movement points requirement for non-NATO or Warsaw Pact countries. It is the movement phase of the player who moves the Iraqi units, but as the non-phasing player can fly ground strike missions during the phasing player's movement phase, it is no surprise that an Iranian squadron swoops in for a well-placed interdiction strike, effectively putting the Iraqi unit out of supply. There is now no possible way to count a supply path of 10 or less movement points to an Iraqi supply source. Of course, to keep going, the 1st Mechanized could still use embedded supply if playing with the detailed supply rules, or the option afforded by the generic supply rules, but the Iranian strike certainly puts a spanner in the works for the Iraqi division. In addition to the standard interdiction ground strike just discussed, the NATO player has a unique type of supply path disruption capability at his disposal, which allows him to interdict Warsaw Pact overland supply. It works as follows. At the beginning of the Warsaw Pact movement phase, the NATO player may require the Soviet player to trace the supply path for any or all his front supply heads. When the supply paths are known, the NATO player may execute a special type of air-ground strike mission called Supply Interdiction Mission on any hex along each supply path. On a fail, the NATO player may launch another attempt. Beyond number of airplanes and possibly supply, there is no limit to the number of supply interdiction missions the NATO player can initiate. On a success, the affected front supply heads are interdicted, and combat units tracing supply to the interdicted front supply head are negatively affected. Multiple successful interdictions on a front supply head supply path does not bring any additional benefits. When playing with the generic supply rules, combat units tracing supply to the interdicted front supply head can move a maximum of 3 hexes on the operational map, and not at all on the LOC map. Also, an impacted combat unit adds +2 combat modifiers to the opponent in land combat. When playing with the detailed supply rules, combat units tracing supply to the interdicted front supply head can move a maximum of 2 hexes on the operational map, and not at all on the LOC map. Of course, using embedded supply points or accessing stockpiled supply allows the impacted unit to overcome these limitations. Also, an affected combat unit adds +4 combat modifiers to the opponent in land combat. Again, this can be mitigated by using embedded or stockpiled supply. Finally, an interdicted front supply head may only contribute to the replenishment of embedded supply to a maximum of 10 divisions during the turn. As with most other air missions, a NATO Supply Interdiction mission can be intercepted by the opponent's air force. Also, the NATO player should try to avoid striking hexes covered by heavy anti-air defenses. For his part, the Soviet player should avoid tracing supply paths where single hexes support multiple front supply heads, as then one successful supply interdiction mission may affect multiple front supply heads. Attacking front supply heads directly is also a helpful tool when creating supply headache for the Soviet player. A front supply head on the losing side in ground combat must be displaced 5 hexes back towards the map edge rail or road hex, used by the front supply head to draw supply. The same applies if the front supply head is the target of a successful enemy air-ground strike. Note that a front supply head can be displaced these ways an unlimited number of times during a single action phase. In addition to messing with the opponent's supply transportation and supply paths, when playing with detailed supply rules, you also have the option of destroying enemy stockpiled supply. This can be done through air-ground strikes or special forces raids. Here the US have started to pile up supply points in allied Kuwait City in preparation for an invasion of Iraq. The Iraqis launch a preemptive ground strike, and for some reason, the Kuwaiti air defences are malfunctioning with unfortunate consequences for the supply storage. Simultaneously, in Denmark, due to city development zoning rules, the air defence system had to be installed so far from Copenhagen it covers neither the city nor the port. And with everyone on vacation when the war breaks out, the Soviet Spetsnaz raid can undisturbed destroy some of the NATO supplies stored in the port. Both in the case of successful ground strikes and raids, a maximum of 5 supply points can be eliminated per successful strike and raid. Okay, so that ends this in-depth guide of the supply rules for the 1985 series of games. There are a small handful of items we have not touched upon, like the possibility for ground units to attempt to ration ammunition, and what happens if a side captures stockpiled supply assembled by the enemy. In the first case, because the rule is very simple and well described. In the second case, because the rules don't contemplate that possibility. Also, supply paths of independent units and a couple of optional supply rules for NATO and the Warsaw Pact were also not covered. All of these are very well explained in the rules. Evidently, the detailed supply rules bring more complexity and administration to the gameplay, but also a much more dynamic, flexible and exciting environment in which to plan and operate. The satisfaction of destroying the opponent logistics plan cannot be overestimated. On the other hand, seeing your supply network being put under pressure by enemy attacks is a nerve-wracking experience. But with this guide, no unit of yours should ever find itself without supply.